In 1800, the capital of the United States was a town of roughly 3,000 people, smaller than Trenton, smaller than Salem, smaller than half a dozen colonial market towns that had been settled for a century before anyone drew a line in the Potomac marshland and called it a federal district. There was one completed wing of the capital, its sandstone still raw from Virginia quarries. There was a presidential mansion, roofless in sections, its walls not yet plastered. Between the two ran a single muddy avenue through a landscape of tree stumps and tidal flats. No harbor of consequence, no industry, no river trade to challenge New York or Philadelphia. No reason by any commercial measure to exist. A visiting congressman described it as a city in ruins before it had finished being built. The Europeans who came and went called it the city of magnificent distances. Not a compliment, a joke about the vast empty intervals between its few buildings and the swampy nothing in between. 2 centuries later, it is the seat of the most powerful government on earth. The distance between those two facts, between 3,000 people in a muddy clearing in the capital of the Western world, is not a story about geography or economics or the slow accumulation of advantage. It is a story about will and compromise, and the strange persistence of a planned city that nobody, at the start, particularly wanted. And it is a story built on a contradiction. A federal district whose boundaries were surveyed in part by a free black astronomer in a city that would sell people who looked like him on its own streets. The most powerful city on earth, whose residents to this day cannot vote for the Congress that rules them. That contradiction has never been resolved. It begins with a bargain made over dinner. Chapter 1. The Bargain and the Plan. The room where it happened was Thomas Jefferson's dining room on Maiden Lane in New York City, and the dinner, held in June of 1790, was not recorded as a great occasion. No formal minutes were taken. No monument marks the address. What happened inside was a trade. The kind of trade American political life runs on, in which two men who despised each other's vision of the country agreed, over a meal, to give each other what they needed most. Alexander Hamilton needed the federal government to assume the Revolutionary War debts of the states. James Madison needed the permanent capital to sit in the South, on the Potomac, where Southern planters would not feel that the Republic's center of gravity had drifted permanently north. Jefferson set the table. The deal was struck. On July 16, 1790, President Washington signed the Residence Act, empowering himself to select the precise location of a federal district on the Potomac, not to exceed 10 miles square. Washington chose ground near his own estate at Mount Vernon, a trapezoid of farmland, woodland, and tidal lowland, where the eastern branch met the main Potomac Channel, drained in part by a sluggish stream called Tiber Creek. The popular legend that the founders planted their capital in a malarial swamp is largely a myth. The ground was not exceptional in its wetness by the standards of the Atlantic seaboard, but it was low, humid in summer, mosquito-ridden, and harder to build on than any optimistic survey could convey. Almost no one at the time acknowledged that single honest fact. The plans moved forward. Enter Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. He was a French-born engineer who had volunteered for the Continental Army as a young man, served under Washington, and carried in his mind a particular idea of what a capital should look like. Not the modest grid of Philadelphia, not the crooked colonial streets of Boston, but something that announced ambition in its very geometry. In 1791, Washington hired him to design the new city. What L'Enfant produced was a Baroque plan of broad diagonal avenues, named for the states, cutting across a rectangular grid at deliberate angles, anchored by 2 focal points, the Capitol on its hill and the President's house on its ridge to the northwest, connected by a ceremonial boulevard that would become Pennsylvania Avenue. The avenues were wide enough that a distant view opened at every intersection. The whole city a sequence of vistas meant to remind any arriving visitor at every turn of the scale of the thing attempted here. L'Enfant was difficult. He refused to share his plans with the district commissioners, demolished the half-built house of a politically connected landowner whose property lay in the path of one of his avenues, and declined every instruction to moderate his independence. Washington dismissed him in 1792. The plan survived him anyway, intact in its essential geometry, because no one who came after produced anything better. The avenues stayed. The grid stayed. The two anchoring buildings stayed where he had placed them. L'Enfant died in poverty in 1825. His compensation claim against the government never settled, and was buried on a Maryland farm. Only decades later were his remains moved to Arlington, and his plan recognized as what it had always been. The boundary survey that fixed the district's edges was run by Andrew Ellicott, a precise and experienced surveyor assisted by Benjamin Banneker. Banneker was a free black man, the son and grandson of formerly enslaved people, self-taught in mathematics and astronomy, who had borrowed a set of instruments and taught himself the celestial calculations required to fix the boundary stones in their correct positions. He was 59 years old in 1791. He helped set the borders of a federal city that would, within the decade, become one of the largest slave markets in North America. The first boundary stone was laid at Jones Point, at the southern tip of the district, in April of 1791. Keep that stone in mind. It will come back. 40 stones in all marked a 10-mile square that existed in 1791 almost entirely on paper, a political decision dressed in survey coordinates imposed on farmland and tidal flat, and the scattered homesteads of families who had not been asked whether the Republic should arrive on their doorstep. The plan was there, the city was not. The geometry was finished. The work had not yet begun. Chapter 2. The City of Magnificent Distances. The government arrived in November of 1800, and the city it arrived in was not what the plans had described. John Adams moved into the executive mansion on November 1st, 1800. The east room was still damp, its plaster not yet applied. The main staircase had not been built at all. 6 fireplaces burned against a cold. The house was too large to hold. Across the muddy expanse that L'Enfant had designated a ceremonial boulevard, Congress assembled in the one finished wing of the Capitol. A building meant to anchor a continental republic, and at the moment of its first use, a single unadorned chamber in an otherwise roofless shell. The city around them held roughly 3,000 people. Philadelphia, which the government had just left, had more than 40,000. New York, more than 60. Washington had boarding houses, a handful of taverns, and Pennsylvania Avenue, the great ceremonial spine meant to connect the Capitol to the President's house across a mile of level ground. It was unpaved. In rain, it became mud deep enough to swallow a carriage wheel. In heat, it became a corridor of dust. Members of Congress arrived each December and left each March as fast as the session allowed, returning to the real cities they had come from, living several to a room in lodgings near the Capitol because there was nowhere else to live. Livestock wandered the streets. The tree stumps L'Enfant's avenues had been cut through were still visible between the buildings. For its first decade and more, the city was a national embarrassment. Not in the way new things are embarrassing through mere incompletion, but in the deeper way of a project that raised the question of whether it had been a mistake from the start. The Europeans who visited wrote home with undisguised amusement. The Americans who governed from it apologized for it, or defended it with the slightly desperate energy of men no longer certain the decision had been correct. The promise was in the plan. The delivery was mud and stumps and the sound of pigs. And then, in August of 1814, the delivery became something worse. The British army that entered Washington on the evening of August 24, 1814, was a punitive expedition commanded by Major General Robert Ross, sent to retaliate for the American burning of York, the capital of Upper Canada, the year before. The soldiers had marched up from the Patuxent in the August heat and found the city emptied. Its defenders routed that afternoon at Bladensburg in a collapse so swift it was afterward called the Bladensburg Races. On the dining table of the president's house, a supper had been laid for 40 guests, prepared in the expectation that the American defenders would return victorious. The British soldiers sat down and ate it. Then they set fire to the house. What followed was systematic. The Capitol, the Treasury, the State Department, the War Department. One by one, the public buildings of the American government were set alight, their interiors consumed, their walls left standing as scorched shells. The Library of Congress burned with everything inside it. The president's house burned until its sandstone was blackened to the foundations. Most of it, in the course of one night, was gone, but not the portrait. Before the house was abandoned, Dolly Madison refused to leave until a full-length portrait of George Washington, painted by Gilbert Stuart, was taken from the dining room wall. The frame was too large to move. Her staff broke it apart and rolled the canvas free. The canvas was carried out and hidden. The house burned. The portrait survived. The storm came the next day. On the morning of August 25th, a weather system moved through Washington with a violence that witnesses would spend years describing as a tornado. Sudden wind and rain that put out the fires, lifted a cannon from its emplacement and dropped its streets away and drove the British back toward their ships. They withdrew. Washington stood, gutted, muddy, its 3,000 residents returning to find the seat of their government in ruins. The Congress that reconvened debated whether to stay. The motion to move the capital to a finished city with real infrastructure and real commerce came to a vote and failed by a narrow margin. The decision that emerged was the first time the country chose Washington on purpose, not as a compromise between regions, not as a concession to hold the Republic together, but as a deliberate act made with the ruins visible from the Capitol's windows, to rebuild on the same ground. By 1817, the president's house was habitable again, rebuilt within its scorched sandstone walls. The city was still a backwater and would remain one for another generation, but it had survived its greatest test. What it would become would wait for a war far larger than the one that burned it. Chapter 3. The War That Made a Capital. In 1861, Washington held just over 75,000 people, smaller than Cincinnati, smaller than St. Louis, smaller than New Orleans. Its streets were unfinished in stretches, its avenues still more aspiration than fact. The great Baroque grid L'Enfant had drawn 70 years earlier existed the way a blueprint exists, in outline, not in substance. Hogs still ran in the alleys off Pennsylvania Avenue. The Capitol Dome was a construction site, its cast-iron ribs rising unfinished against the sky. And across the Potomac, Confederate Virginia began at the river's south bank. A well-placed artillery battery in Alexandria could reach the White House. The city was not uniformly loyal. Families in Georgetown had sons in Southern regiments. Maryland, which wrapped the district on three sides, never formally seceded and never formally committed. In the weeks after Fort Sumter, before Union troops arrived in force, Washington was not obviously a city the Union would be able to keep. What changed that calculus was not rhetoric. It was engineering. Union commanders ringed the Capitol with earthworks at a scale that had no precedent in North America. 68 forts, a 35-mile perimeter of trenches and artillery emplacements that enclosed the city in a continuous arc from the Virginia shore to the Maryland uplands and back. Soldiers built them. Engineers designed them. And formerly enslaved men who had walked or waded into Union lines. Contrabands, in the language of the time, dug alongside them, grading earthen walls, hauling timber, cutting fields of fire through the scrub oak. Not metaphorical fortifications. Earthworks with walls thick enough to absorb siege guns, which turned the half-empty capital into something it had never been, an armed camp nobody was going to take. Into those half-empty avenues came the army. Hospitals filled the patent office and Georgetown College. Supply depots and barracks rose on vacant land that had waited since L'Enfant's time for a city to grow into it. The population did not merely increase, it doubled. By 1870, Washington held almost 132,000 people, nearly every one of them drawn there by the gravitational pull of a war that had no other administrative center. The city the war found was a muddy backwater. The city the war built was a functioning capital. April 16, 1862. Congress abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. 8 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. The mechanism was deliberate and financially precise. The federal government would compensate owners for the people they freed, at an average of about $300 per person up to a total of $1 million. Not liberation by proclamation, compensation by check. The capital of a republic that had been buying and selling human beings on its own street corners for 60 years purchased its way out of that condition, one name at a time. While the country was still at war over whether it would do the same everywhere else. It happened here first. The city had not chosen the distinction. Congress had assigned it. December 2nd, 1863. The war had run 2.5 years. The casualties from Gettysburg alone had passed 50,000. And on that morning, in the middle of all of it, the cast-iron dome of the United States Capitol was completed, and the bronze Statue of Freedom was raised, section by section, by crane and rope, to the top of it. The statue weighed some 15,000 pounds. It rose in 5 pieces, each bolted to the one below, until the figure stood 19.5 feet above the dome, facing east. The man who had done much of the skilled work casting her at the foundry on the edge of the city was Philip Reed, enslaved in Washington until the district freed him the previous April. A statue of freedom, cast in large part by a man the city had owned the year before, raised over a capital that had been a slave market, over a republic tearing itself apart about whether the word freedom applied to everyone inside its borders. Lincoln had insisted the construction continue throughout the war. Every time a foreman raised the question of postponement, the answer came back the same. The work goes on. The dome rising over a city at war was not incidental to his purpose. It was the purpose. A signal, visible from the Virginia shore, that the Union intended to finish what it had started. The dome was completed. The statue went up. The war was not yet half over. What followed would be the making of a grand city. The Washington Monument at last finished, the mall remade, the ceremonial core rising from the mud of L'Enfant's unbuilt vision into stone and marble, and the permanent weight of a world capital. But that story begins with a stump. Chapter 4. The Stump. The Washington Monument stood, in the summer of 1860, at a height of about 150 feet. Not finished, not abandoned. Somewhere between the two. A truncated shaft of Maryland marble rising out of the Potomac Plain, too short to be a monument and too expensive to demolish, looking less like a tribute to the first president than like a pier waiting for a bridge that had not come. It had been begun in 1848, the cornerstone laid on the 4th of July, while a crowd of 20,000 watched. The plan called for a completed obelisk of 555 feet, the tallest structure in the world by a wide margin. What stood a dozen years later was about a third of that. About a third, and silent, and stopped. The trouble came in 1854, not from a shortage of stone or money alone, but from the American talent for turning a civic project into a proxy war for something else. The Monument Society accepted a block of marble from Pope Pius IX, donated as a gesture of goodwill. The Know-Nothings, the nativist, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant movement, then at the height of its influence, decided the Pope's stone had no place in a monument to an American hero. One night in March of 1854, a group of them broke into the storage yard, seized the block, and threw it into the Potomac. Then they disrupted the society's affairs enough to seize control of it and halt construction entirely. They threw a memorial stone into the river and stopped building a monument to George Washington. For more than 20 years, it stood as it was. Through the secession debates and the burning summer of 1861, through the war, while Lincoln's cast-iron dome went up a mile away, and Philip Reed's Statue of Freedom rose into the wartime sky. Through Appomattox and Reconstruction, the stump remained. Its exposed top collected weather, the marble discoloring from exposure, pigeons nesting at the broken edge. The city grew around it and past it. Hospitals, depots, a doubled population, a cast-iron dome that was the envy of any republic in the world. And still the half-built shaft sat on the Potomac Plain, unavoidable and slightly humiliating, a monument to the distance between American intention and American follow-through. Work resumed in 1876 when Congress appropriated funds and the Army Corps of Engineers took over. The stone quarried to continue did not match. 20-some years of weathering had shifted the color of the original marble, exposure, oxidation, the slow chemistry of stone and air, and the new blocks came out paler, subtly different in tone from what had been laid before the Know-Nothings through the Pope's stone in the river. The engineers knew it. They used the stone anyway, because the alternative was to stop again, and the country had had enough of stopping. The monument was completed in 1884. It became the tallest structure in the world, taller than Cologne Cathedral, taller than the Strasbourg spire that had held the record before it, taller than anything human hands had yet raised into open air. It held that distinction for about 5 years, until the Eiffel Tower passed it in 1889. 5 years of supremacy, then surpassed. Stand at the base today and look up. About a third of the way to the top, the marble changes color. A horizontal band, not dramatic, not invisible, where the stone of the 1850s meets the stone of the 1880s. Where the Know-Nothing stopped the work, the seam is visible to anyone who looks. The interruption is not metaphor, it is masonry. The country's stalled years, its funding fights, its nativist convulsions, the 2 decades it could not finish what it started. All of it written in a color shift in marble, a third of the way up, readable on any clear afternoon from the mall. Keep that seam in mind. We will come back to it. The monument was the city's most visible wound, but it was not the only one. Below it, in the streets, l'enfant had drawn and the war had filled, and decades of indifferent government had left in mud and incompletion. There was work of a different kind still waiting. Work that required not engineers and appropriations, but a single man willing to spend money the city did not have on a transformation it could not afford to delay. His name was Alexander Shepard. What he was about to do to Washington would either save it or break it. It did both. Chapter 5. The Man Who Paved the Swamp. Alexander Roby Shepard was a Washington native, born in the city in 1835, which made him almost exactly as old as the city itself. He grew up on its mud streets, learned the plumbing trade as a boy, and by his mid-30s had turned that apprenticeship into a construction and real estate business with enough leverage to buy his way into Republican city politics. He was large, direct, and constitutionally impatient with the speed at which official Washington conducted its business. He had lived his whole life in a half-built capital, and he had reached a conclusion many residents shared, but few were positioned to act on. The city would not improve through the ordinary mechanisms of civic patience. It required someone willing to spend first and account for it later. In 1871, Congress reorganized the district as a territory, with an appointed governor and an elected legislature. Shepard took the vice presidency of the new Board of Public Works. And it was the board, not the governor's chair, where the real power over the city's physical condition lay. He moved at once. Streets were graded. Sewers were dug. Pennsylvania Avenue, the ceremonial spine that had been an unpaved track through the administrations of 11 presidents, was at last paved. Tiber Creek, the sluggish drainage channel that had run through the heart of the city since L'Enfant's time, was filled in. The Washington City Canal, a fetid open waterway along what would become Constitution Avenue, by the 1870s little more than a receptacle for the city's waste, was closed and buried. The creek that had defined the low ground of the original settlement disappeared below the pavement, as if the city were covering its own origins. The transformation was physical in a way no previous administration had attempted, and none afterward would match for speed. Tens of thousands of trees were planted along the avenues. Miles of street were paved, miles of sewer laid beneath a city that had relied, in places, on open drainage ditches within sight of the Capitol. Shepard ran the projects simultaneously across every ward on the theory that a city rebuilt in pieces was a city that would take a generation, and a city rebuilt all at once was a city you could finish before the money ran out. He was right about the method. He was reckless about the money. The board had been authorized a budget of about $6 million. The work ran far past it. By the time it was substantially complete in 1874, the district carried a debt of roughly $13 million against a tax base that could not service it and against the backdrop of the Panic of 1873, which had contracted credit markets across the country and left municipal governments everywhere scrambling for solvency. Shepard had built the modern city. He had also broken its finances doing it. Congress responded with a decision that would outlast the debt by a century. In 1874, the territorial government was abolished entirely. No more elected legislature, no more local governor. In their place, three commissioners appointed by the President of the United States, answering to Congress, reporting to no constituency that could remove them. The residents of Washington, the city Shepard had just drained and paved and planted at ruinous cost, lost the right to elect the government that administered their own streets. Not one of them voted for the arrangement. Not one of them was asked. The irony needs no decoration. Shepard built the city the Capitol had promised to be for 75 years. Graded and sewered and lit and planted, a city visiting dignitaries no longer had to apologize for, and in the process cost its citizens their voice in governing it. The bill Congress sent back was paid not in dollars, but in democratic rights. Shepard himself was finished. A Senate investigation in 1874 found financial irregularities in the board's contracting. He left for Mexico, ran a silver mine, and died there in 1902, having rebuilt one capital and never returned to it. Congress would govern the district directly through appointed commissioners for the next 99 years. The streets Shepard paved would stay paved. The city he made possible would go on being built, grander, more ceremonial, more permanent than anything he had put in the ground. But the next transformation would be the work not of a single impatient builder, but of a Senate, commissioned with ambitions drawn from the old L'Enfant plan and the resources of a rising world power. The mall was waiting to be remade. Chapter 6. The Great Plan. In 1901, the National Mall was not the thing the world would come to know. It was a disorder of Victorian landscaping, curving carriage paths, irregular clusters of trees, in the naturalistic style Andrew Jackson Downing had imposed decades before, interrupted, at its center, by the tracks and sheds of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. A passenger terminal sat inside the open axis that L'Enfant had designated, a century earlier, as the grand ceremonial corridor of the Republic. Trains arrived and departed 200 yards from the base of the Capitol. The mall that Lincoln had seen from the new dome, the mall that Shepard had paved around but never touched, was still cluttered, still waiting, still incomplete. What changed it was a commission with unusual authority and unusual taste. Senator James McMillan of Michigan convened the Senate Park Commission in 1901, not a body of politicians balancing interests, but a gathering of the country's finest designers, assembled for the explicit purpose of finishing what L'Enfant had started. McMillan appointed Daniel Burnham, who had built the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition into a model of civic grandeur. He appointed Charles McKim of the great neoclassical firm McKim, Mead, and White. He appointed Frederick Law Olmsted, Jr., son of the man who had remade Central Park. And he appointed Augustus St. Gaudens, the foremost American sculptor of his generation. Burnham, McKim, Olmsted, St. Gaudens. The commission read like a catalog of American design at its height. They went first to Europe, to Rome, to Paris, to London and Vienna, studying how the great capitals organized their ceremonial hearts. They came back with an answer that was not new. It was, in almost every essential, the plan L'Enfant had drawn in 1791, the broad open axis, the long green expanse between the Capitol and the river, the symmetry of building and landscape in a frame that announced the permanence of the Republic. They did not invent a vision, they resurrected one. What followed was demolition before construction. The railroad tracks came out. The station at the mall's center was cleared. The curving paths were straightened, the Victorian tree clusters removed. The mall was narrowed and leveled to a clean green rectangle flanked by a double row of American elms. A corridor of grass and canopy that made the Capitol on its eastern hill and the ground to the west the endpoints of a single composed view. What L'Enfant had drawn as a diagram of power, Macmillan's commission made into a physical fact. They cleared away a century of compromise and left the axis open. The plan rebuilt the ceremonial city in stages, each stage permanent. Union Station opened in 1907. Burnham's own design, a barrel-vaulted Beaux-Arts hall that replaced the demolished railroad shed and gave the Capitol an arrival worthy of a world power. The Lincoln Memorial was dedicated on May 30th, 1922, on ground at the mall's western end that had been tidal flat and fill when the commission began its work. Henry Bacon designed it, a Greek temple in white Colorado marble above a new reflecting pool. It seated Lincoln 19 feet high and visible from the Capitol steps 2 miles east, built on reclaimed land. It anchored the axis at its western end and closed the composition L'Enfant had opened 130 years before. The mall became something a city plan can only become if history cooperates, a stage. Not a park, not a boulevard, not a monument garden. A stage, the long green floor on which the nation would hold its rituals and, in time, its arguments with itself. Inaugurations, state funerals, the victory crowds after the Second World War, the March of 1963, when 250,000 people stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial and heard from those steps that the country had deferred a promise long enough. The commission had not designed a stage. It had cleared the ground, held the axis open, and anchored the ends. And the nation found, repeatedly and with millions of witnesses, that such a space had only one use. What remained when the plan was complete was a Capitol finally proportionate to its own ambitions. A greater test was coming. Chapter 7. The Capital of the World. For a century and a quarter, the The federal government had been a modest presence in its own city. There had always been agencies, departments, bureaus, the machinery of a continental republic conducting its business in the buildings Shepard had given streets and Macmillan had given monuments. Modest is the right word. In 1930, the entire civilian federal workforce in Washington numbered around 70,000, administering a country of 120 million from offices a mid-sized American city might have recognized as its own. The scale of the government in Washington bore no relationship to the scale of the country it governed. That was about to change. Franklin Roosevelt arrived in March of 1933, and within 100 days the government had revised its understanding of its own size. The New Deal did not expand federal authority incrementally. It replicated it, department by department, in a burst of institutional invention that produced so many new acronyms, the press gave them a collective name: the Alphabet Agencies. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the National Recovery Administration, the Public Works Administration. New buildings rose along Constitution and Independence Avenues to house them. The Federal Triangle filled the land between Pennsylvania Avenue and the Mall with agencies that occupied more office space than the city had held in its entire previous history. Tens of thousands of clerks poured in from every state, drawn by the news that the government was hiring at a moment when nothing else was. Boarding houses filled. Streetcars ran past midnight. For the first time, the city had a simple and sufficient reason to be the largest in its region. The Second World War completed the transformation at a pace that made the New Deal look gradual. After December 1941, Washington became the command center of a global war fought in North Africa, Western Europe, the Pacific, and a dozen subsidiary theaters. The building thrown up across the Potomac in Virginia, 5 concentric rings of concrete, completed in January of 1943 after 16 months of construction, was not called a large building. It was called the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world, with 17.5 miles of corridor, built to hold the War Department. The War Department grew to fill it. The city could not absorb what it was being asked to house. Temporary office buildings, the tempos, went up along the reflecting pool and on the mall itself, raw wooden sheds that violated every principle the Macmillan Commission had set for the ceremonial corps. They rose in weeks and stood for years. Women arrived by the thousands to staff the expanded agencies. Row houses were subdivided. Private homes opened spare rooms. There was nowhere else to put the people the government could not stop hiring. By 1950, the census recorded 802,178 people in the District of Columbia. 802,000 in a city that had held 3,000 in 1800, 75,000 when the Civil War found it, nearly 300,000 at the turn of the century. It was the peak. The city would never again hold so many people within its boundaries. After 1945, the math of Washington's place in the world was simple to state and hard to believe. It was no longer the capital of the United States in any ordinary sense. It was the capital of the Western world, the headquarters of a nuclear superpower, the seat of the institutions that would organize the post-war order, the address to which every other government directed its ambassadors and its anxieties. The muddy clearing on the Potomac Flat, the place a congressman had called a city in ruins before it had finished being built, was now the city that ran the world. It had been accomplished, in the end, not by geography or commerce, but by crisis, by the depression that brought the clerks, by the war that brought the generals, by the force of events that turned the planned city into the necessary one. The power was real. The grandeur was real. The marble and the monuments and the bronze statue of freedom above the dome, all of it was real. But beneath the power, the city carried contradictions it had never resolved. The people who lived beneath those monuments still could not vote for the Congress that ruled their streets, and the neighborhoods where most of Washington's black residents lived. The majority, the national statistics did not capture, and the ceremonial city had been built to ignore, had their own story. And it was not the story of the world capital's rise. That reckoning would arrive not over decades, but on a single April night, with fire. Chapter 8: What Remains. The fire came on the night of April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot on a motel balcony in Memphis at 1 minute past 6 in the evening. And within hours, the city that governed the world could not govern its own streets. The riots that erupted near 14th and U Streets moved through the corridor with a speed and grief no government commission had prepared for. Not the Congress 3 miles away. Not the 3 presidentially appointed commissioners who had administered the district since 1874. Without the consent of a single resident. Not the White House 4 blocks from the mall. 13 people died. The U Street corridor, the center of a black cultural life that had no equal between Harlem and Atlanta, burned, and did not come back, not for a generation. Black Broadway went dark the way a place goes dark when its economic tissue is destroyed and nobody in the buildings where laws are made has a sufficient stake in the rebuilding. The most powerful capital on earth could not protect the black neighborhoods inside its own boundary stones. That word, boundaries, is worth holding. Benjamin Banneker helped fix them, a free black man, 59 years old, self-taught in mathematics and astronomy, who ran the survey that placed the first stone at Jones Point in April of 1791. The city he helped draw into existence on the tidal lowland became within a decade one of the largest slave markets in North America. By 1957, it was the first majority black city in the United States. By 1971, more than 70% of its residents were black. A city called Chocolate City, anchored by Howard University, animated by the U Street corridor that had held Duke Ellington and the Lincoln Theater in a single stretch. The 2020 census counted 689,545 people, a city remade again by gentrification, its longtime black residents pushed outward to Prince George's County and beyond, while the monuments drew millions of visitors who had come to see the city that belonged, in theory, to everyone. The other contradiction was old and specific. In 1874, when Shepherd left the city bankrupt and Congress abolished the territorial government, the residents of Washington lost the right to elect the body that administered their own streets. That loss was not framed as temporary. It persisted through the Civil War monuments, through the Macmillan Plan, through the New Deal agencies, and the Pentagon, and the peak census of 802,178 in 1950. It persisted through the riots and the ruins. Not until the Home Rule Act of 1973 could the people of the district elect their own mayor and council. 99 years. And the residents had served every one of them. The 23rd Amendment, ratified in 1961, gave the district electoral votes for president, but to this day it has no voting member of Congress. The license plates on the cars that pass the monuments every morning read taxation without representation, not as a slogan, as a fact stamped on government metal. The grandeur is real. The power is real. The marble and the monuments and the bronze statue of freedom raised to the top of the dome by men who had been enslaved in the city the year before, all of it is real. So is the gap between the inscription on the public building and the answer on the license plate. 690,000 people live inside the boundaries Banneker helped to fix. They cannot vote for the Congress 2 miles from their front doors. The mall draws millions past the Lincoln Memorial, past the long green axis the Macmillan Commission cleared, and the Senate money paved. And most of them do not know they are visiting the only capital in the democratic world whose permanent residents hold no seat in the legislature that governs them. Stand on the mall on any clear afternoon and look toward the monument. It rises 555 feet above the tidal lowland, white against whatever the sky is doing. About a third of the way up. Not dramatic, not hidden, readable from the grass if you look for it. The marble changes color. A horizontal seam where the stone of the 1850s meets the stone of the 1880s, where the money ran out, and the know-nothings came and the country stopped building, and then, a generation later, decided to finish. The seam is still there.